All right, we are ready to go. It's good to see everyone. Good morning. This week we have the privilege of studying the Haftarah for Parshas Vayera, which is the from the book of Malachim Bet from Kings, 2 Kings, chapter 4, 1 through 37. A nice amount. The Svardim only read the first 23 verses of this story, and maybe as we describe it, as we learn it together, we'll see a little bit the reason for the differences. I don't have the Stone Chumash in front of me, so if someone knows what the page is in that to help others out, that'd be great.
11:34.
Awesome. All right, thanks. As hopefully by now we know, just by saying that this is from Malachim Bet, from 2 Kings, we know that as opposed to what we've seen the last 3 weeks from Yeshayahu, that we're really going to see more of a story, and that's really what we have the opportunity to study today. Not prophecy and poetry, but more of a narrative that unfolds, and that's exactly what we see today. And we really see 2 stories. The first, and there are a lot of ways that these tales are interwoven, and particularly if you're studying really carefully the text. You see some of those literary aspects that tie these stories together, and in the midrash and the rabbinic imagination, we see them being connected as well, which is a sensitivity to the text that we're reading. But we see 2 stories here. We see the first is Isha Achat. There's one woman who is a wife of the Bnei HaNevi'im, a disciple of the prophets, and we'll see that she's in a financial strain, and we have a miracle. And the second is we are engaged to a woman, Isha Shunamit, who is this illustrious, regal woman who also plays a protagonist character in the second story. And both of these are really around the prophet Elisha. Elisha is the student of Eliyahu Hanavi. He's the one who's left with the mantle, quite literally, of leadership that Elijah the prophet leaves behind, and we see his star pupil in our story, which is the pupil, which is Gehazi, is his apprentice, soon to be disgraced, but right now is still a functioning apprentice of the prophet. And we'll, obviously on the backdrop of this is Parshas Vayera, which we read this week, which is the story of the birth of Yitzchak, foretelling the birth of Yitzchak, the destruction of Sodom, and obviously the end of the parsha is Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And so that's sort of in the back of our mind, which we'll hopefully come back to as we look at this parsha. And just to read the Haftarah and take a moment to look at the Haftarah itself is worth it, because this is a great Haftarah, like all the Haftarah, but it's a beautiful story and narrative that really carries us. And as we read it, I guess I want to give the introduction. I remember hearing a perspective of Rabbi Yaakov Meidan, who was a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Har Etzion, who was really a creative Torah thinker in terms of pshat, and he really points out that our Haftarah, the story of our Haftarah, is a critical story, not necessarily for its connection to our parsha, but it's a crossroads in what we describe about the role of prophecy in general. We have already noted, and I started this year and every one where we look at it, as describe the difference between early prophets and later prophets, right? That one is more poetry and prophecy. The others are more stories. But part of that is the type of stories that we're reading. We'll read this story here, and sort of just I keep referring to it and going around. The first one is this woman comes that her children are essentially being taken by creditors because she needs money and her husband's dead. And the prophet does a great miracle, tells her, what's in your house, collect all different pots and pans, borrow from all your friends, take from within your house a kad of shemen, a little bit of oil, pour it into the pots, and the miracle happens. That it just keeps pouring, and it keeps going until all of the pots and everything that she collected are full, and then it stops to pour. Right, it's a great miracle that a little bit of oil pours and fills every one of the different vessels, and then the prophet tells her, go sell the oil, and the income that you make from the oil, pay off your creditors, and you'll be okay, right? And the second is this story of the Isha Shunami, this wonderful regal woman who welcomes the prophet every time he comes through. Every time Elisha comes to the area, she becomes his designated hosting spot. He makes for him a little bit of a room and a table and a chair and that component. And then eventually he says, can I do something for you? Can I pay you back? Can I talk to the king for you? Can I speak to the administrator? Can I do something for you as a token of my gratitude? And she says no, and she says no. And then ultimately him and Gehazi, his servant, sort of conspire together, and they decide that she needs a child. She's childless, and she needs a child, and he gives her a blessing that she should have a child. She does have a child, and then the child dies. And she goes to Elisha, and she complains to him that her child dies, and ultimately he revives the child, and the child lives. Right? Two incredible miracles. Right? And I once heard Rabbi John describe this in Hebrew, that Elisha is sort of a prophet that goes around Israel with his bag full of miracles. Right? There's no problem that he finds that a good miracle can't solve. Right? And it's very different than what we expect to happen. First of all, these two stories. The first story is all about this impoverished woman. Right? We obviously know that there's the biblical command to help the poor, especially when there are people or creditors coming to take things from her. Right? Not just the poor, but the yatom, the almanah, the widow, the orphan. These fit every category that we're told to look out for. But the Torah never tells us to do a miracle to magically supply her with a gold tree and make sure that she can pay off all her debts. Right? But here Elisha sort of does that. And what we see over here, at least what Medan would say, if we would appreciate it in its source, in its text, in Melachim, is a crossroads. As the prophets of old, Shmuel, Eliyahu, Elisha, they were people who went around with their bags full of miracles and tricks. Whereas later prophets, Yecheskel, Yirmiyahu, they transition, and their roles are a little bit different. They are more prophets to share information and oracle on a national level, and they do not perform miracles, only miracles that are done to help illustrate their point. Meaning they'll, we have whether some of these visions of Ezekiel with the dry bones being brought to life and stuff like that are dreams or they actually happen. All of those ideas are really about forming a point that it's part of the rhetorical environment, right? Elisha, I mean, we're not going to read all of it, but Elisha, in the chapters that precede this, right? He comes to a water and there's no bridge. So what does he do? He takes his kodah, he puts it on the ground, and what happened? The water splits, right? No bridge, no problem, right? He splits the water. There's the food is poisonous. He sprinkles some salt on it, and it's purified. There are youths that are bothering him, right? He sends some animals to clear it up, right? Elisha is perhaps an exaggerated story of this prophet. He is the ultimate example of this prophet that never saw a problem that couldn't be solved by miracle. And we begin to see a transition, and I think that is an incredibly integral part of the story of prophecy and prophets that this chapter is a insight into. And we actually begin to see it. If you look carefully at the story as it unfolds, we begin to see a little bit of that. And that's what I want to spend some time looking at. We'll use the first story as a foil to that, and then we'll focus at the second story. All right? So let's just look at the first story. So you have the Isha Achat. We have this one woman from Bnei HaNevi'im that she cries out to Elisha, and she says, I need help. right? And this is what we would expect, right? The prophet, there were these schools of prophets. We see from B'nai HaNevi'im that she is a widow from the disciples of the prophets. At least according to tradition, that she is the wife of Ovadia, but that's a whole separate question about what exactly her role is. But this is what we expect, right? The prophet is here to help the individual in their time of need. I'll give you another example. What is Shaul's first introduction to Shmuel before he gets made king? Does anyone remember? And we'll read this in the coming weeks. So if you recall, Shaul is out looking for something. What's he looking for?
Livestock of his father's.
Right. He's looking for his livestock of his father. I believe it's sheep or donkeys. I think it's, I don't remember. And what happens, right? He goes here, he goes there, he goes to a well. And what do they say? Oh, the prophet's in town. The prophet's in town. Let's go ask the prophet, right? And so he eventually meets Shaul, he meets Shmuel, because that's what you do. You're looking for something, don't look for it. Go ask a prophet where it is, right? So the same thing here. Alicia, this woman is stuck. This woman is in a difficult situation. Don't go to the Gemach. Go to the prophet and ask the prophet what to do. Now clearly she has some connection to the prophet. Her husband was from the school of prophets who are studying to do these things, right? It seems to be it was a trait. You could tap into some sort of Ruach HaKodesh and help people. Cantor Cohen, your background is creating true envy for so many. Right? So what happens? So he does a miracle for her. He helps her out. He does a miracle for her. And that's the story, right? Those are the people the prophet normally engages with. Enter chapter verse 8. And this is where we already begin to see something different. Vayi hayom, and there were days where Alicia would go visit this area, and there was a woman there, a great woman, a woman of stature that would call him to eat by him. Normally, when this would happen, we would expect that she would have something, right? What we're expecting, based on this background I just gave, is that she would need something for him to do. She would need a favor from him. She would need his help with something. She would need his direction or his guidance or something, right? But what's surprising here is that expectation is frustrated. And it's frustrated explicitly. We'll see. She says, anytime you come, you're a holy person, stay by me, right? And she made for him a little room, and she put a mitah, a shulchan, and a menorah, and a chair, right? So he would stay there. What is that reminiscent of? We'll come back. This is another motif I want to pick up on. A shulchan and a menorah, that language. Who else gets a small room with a table and a chair and a menorah? Where's the only other time in the Torah where the first thing you think about when you say menorah?
Mishkan.
The Mishkan. God gets a small room to rest within the people with a table and a menorah. And one of the things that we'll see here is that one of the changes that is going to happen is that what I would claim, I'm sort of spilling the beans before we get to it, is that Alicia, this story is actually a rebuke on Alicia. This idea, God is unhappy with this idea that you could just go do a miracle wherever you want. And that part of what gets recaptured here is, I wouldn't say a confusion, but we'll see Alicia be casted in this story as God, not as a messenger of God. And then at the end, it ultimately gets corrected. Alicia gets sort of put in his place. And this begins the transition of the roles of prophets. But we see over here, we're building up an expectation that Alicia is like God. God got a room with a table and a menorah. Alicia gets a room with a table and a menorah, right? And we would right. And every time she comes, verse 12, Vayomer el Gehazi Na'aro, call this Shunamit and ask her to come before me, right? What would you expect if something's happening, right? She would need, if she's going out of her way to help the prophet, she needs something. And when she doesn't ask him for something, he is going to ask her what she wants, right? And she says, why'd you do this? What can I do for you? Ma la'asot lach, what can I do for you, right? I'm in the service business. People don't do this for me unless they want something. Should I speak to you, on you, to the king? Should I, suggest that you get a political position or that you get favored treatment from the king? or to the head of the army. And what did she say? No, I'm a simple person. I'm doing this as a chesed. I don't want anything from you, right? What do we expect? We expect that she wants something from the prophet. Not only does she not want something from the prophet, but we go out of our way to say the prophet is trying to solicit from her something that she needs. And she says no. She rebuffs it.
She's so modest.
Right? She doesn't want that. Right. So that goes on. Vayomer, and she goes further. What happens? The prophet won't take that for an answer. The prophet's like, God, I know better than her. She doesn't want anything. I'm going to figure that out, right? Vayomer, Gehazi says, she doesn't have a child and she's old and her husband's old, right? Right? She's old. They're old. They don't have a child, right? Very similar to
Avraham.
Right? Obviously.
Avram and Sarah.
Vayomer, exactly. Vayomer, Krala, call her, and he calls her, and she says, La'et hazeh, ka'et chaya, right? When this happens, you'll be choveket ben, you'll have a child, you'll be able to have a child, right? Again, this is sort of that comparison to our parsha, and again, where we sort of the Shunamit, the Isha Shunamit is told that she'll have a child at a certain point, and in our parsha also, the time will come, the same language, the season will change, and you'll have a child. But what's sort of interesting here is, if you read the next line, Vatarisha, Vatela ben, she became pregnant, she had a child, Ramoed Hazet, to the change of the season, Ka'et Chaya Sher Diber Alaha Elisha, like Elisha spoke to her. In our parsha, we have the same pasuk, but something slightly different. Sarah conceived, and she bore a child to Yaakov, Ka'et Chaya, Asher Diber Hashem, that God spoke to her, right? Right, and so we see already the Navi is sort of using the same language to play off of the story in our parsha as a critique, as a foil of Elisha. Right? Normally we've read Haftarot, and we've said the Haftarah is giving us interpretation on our parsha. What I'm suggesting here is the opposite. Our parsha is giving us a commentary on our Haftarah. Then in Haftarah, the messengers of God recognize that they were just messengers of God, and the time frame of the miracle for Sarah to have a child comes from God, whereas Elisha is being described here as the causer of that miracle, and seemingly again being put in a role that Elisha plays God, right? Which is this interesting happens, right? So what happens? He grows up, right? Elisha provides her a child. He grows up. Sarah is provided a child. He grows up. We have this idea of Vaidal Hanar or Vaidal Hayaled. The child grows up. In our parsha, we'll read of a big party that Sarah makes when she weans Yitzchak, right? And we'll read over here again, he grows up and he goes out, and then he gets sick. Yitzchak survives. You can do the parallel as well. Yitzchak ultimately is brought to the altar and is almost sacrificed. This child dies, right? He's not feeling well. Roshi has a headache. And the Vayomer El Hanar Seo El Imo, bring him home, take him to his mom, right? And he brings her back home, and he dies in the afternoon. And she lays him on the bed that she had set aside for the Isha Elokim, for Elisha. And she goes to Elisha, and she goes and she says, "Why'd you do this? Why'd you do this? You mock me that this has happened. You mock me that this has happened." And what does Elisha say? He dispatches verse 25, verse 26. What is he? He dispatches his right-hand man. He dispatches Gehazi, and he goes and says, "Let's fix this with a miracle, right? Go take my staff, put it on him, and when you get there, he'll be okay. Don't talk to anyone, just go do it." Right? And that's what happens, right? He goes, he gets there. Verse 29. Verse 29. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped the important part, and I got ahead of myself. She comes to the prophet, and the prophet doesn't know why she's coming, right? And we actually see that, right? Verse 27. Vayomer ish Elokim. Elisha says, I don't know what's going on. Her soul is bittered. The Hashem and God hid from me, and I don't know what it is, right? So we see over here the beginning of this change. Elisha knows everything, can do a miracle to solve everything, and all of a sudden, now he sees there's this issue. He thought he was so smart. He knew what she needed even more than she did. He provided her a child, and she says, don't mock me. She ultimately is mocked in the end of the day because the child dies, and she comes back, and Elisha has no idea what he's walking into, right? He doesn't know why she's come back. So he tells her, and what is he devises this plan. He sends Gehazi, and what happens? Gehazi puts the staff on the child's mouth, verse 31, and nothing happens. The child doesn't wake up. The miracle fails. Elisha isn't, you can't just pull a miracle out of the bag. So Elisha comes to the house, and we finally see a change in Elisha's perspective. Verse 33. He closes the door, similar to what happened in the previous story, where he closed the door before they poured all the oil. But this time what happens? By Talal Hashem, he davens to God. He recognizes that ultimately God has a role in this story, right? God has a role in this story. And he goes onto the child's bed, mouth to mouth, eye to eye, palm to palm. He sort of lays on top of the child, and he warms the body of the child, and the child wakes up, is saved, and he gets up. He calls the woman, and she leaves with her child, right? And so we have this really interesting conclusion here, where it gets to this point where he's not ultimately able to do a miracle. He needs to pray to God for some redemption. He needs to pray to God for help, and ultimately God makes that happen, and that's what happens here. And part of the way I'm phrasing this, and some of the points that we've been highlighting, is this very brief glimpse into perhaps the changing role of the prophet. Because we know that the prophets start like one way. We'll get to you in 1 second, Cantor. We know that prophet starts one way, and we know that prophets end, Malachi, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, they're not doing these miracles, right? Yirmiyahu isn't, miraculously causing, the king to listen to him and saving all these things. We see that the role of prophets have changed, and perhaps what I would like to claim, it's not my claim, it's a perspective of Rabbi Dan and a couple other thinkers at the Herzog Institute for Tanakh, that this is the beginning of that change. This represents that change we see, and it's really instigated by this Isha Shunamit, who starts treating the prophet differently, and doesn't use him like an ATM, like, oh, I'm going to give you something, you're going to do a miracle for me, and that begins to highlight the changing role of the prophet and prophecy, and you can read that from this whole notion of he really wants to do something for her. She says no. She says, just don't mock me. I told you, I didn't ask for a child, and I told you when you gave me a child, don't mock me. It's actually there's an interesting way of reading this. We talk about the challenges of infertility, which face many, many people, but you read this story as like a how to not engage someone who is struggling with that. And you read the story, and it's so powerful, the emotion of this woman about, her biggest concern is, I've already made my peace with this. Don't mock me again. Don't bring that up. Don't cause, you give me a child and then you take it away. It's almost worse than having never. I made my peace with who I am. And there's a very powerful piece there, which we're not going to talk about today, but you can really read that throughout the story, and it's a very powerful and appropriate piece. And I think that is one of the central pieces. I do want to then talk about, well, what does that have to do in conversation with our parsha? But Cantor Cohen, you had a question or a comment?
Just a comment that I think it's a very important part of the story that Elisha prayed to God for. He didn't really perform the miracle totally by himself, but that he called upon God's help. Perhaps, you can even look at it that it was God's miracle that saved the child.
I think for sure. And I think that is the changing point of the story. That is why it works. That's why Gehazi's miracle doesn't work. Elisha sent Gehazi to do it also. It didn't work. I think I think that is the moment, the climax of the story that changes. And then all of a sudden it works. She goes home. And Elisha is perhaps more changed than anyone else in the story.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Could it be alternatively viewed that the problem with it not working has to do not with Elisha, but with Gehazi being the instrumentality of trying to revive the boy? Maybe it foreshadows the problem that Gehazi is going to have in the future, or maybe Gehazi was doing some things that were not so terrific even then that we may not know about.
It's interesting to read Gehazi as a character here. I sort of read him more as an instrument of the prophet, just like the prophet has a staff, the prophet has Gehazi, right? The prophet sort of starts as, what can I do for her? And Gehazi says, oh, she doesn't have a child. He's like a source of information. You get the feeling that that Gehazi is very passive in this story, and that the prophet really is the protagonist, and Gehazi is really just an instrument that happens to be alive. But you could read that as, and therefore the bad information is Gehazi. He jumped to know what she wanted, and he's not able to do that. But then then it takes away a little bit of the power. And then what? The prophet was just tricked by Gehazi over and over again. And I'm not sure. And then why is it so important that he pray to God when in the previous miracle that we read, he doesn't pray to God for, right? He just his miracles all around. This is a miracle, that's a miracle. I think so therefore I read it much more as a conversation about Elisha. So I think a couple of things. How does this fit with our parsha, right? So there's a really interesting tradition that, so obviously there are textual components, right? This idea of a child being born to a woman and a husband who are very old. The language of Ka'et Chaya, which is clearly in both places. There's also the significance of the faith of the two children, right? Abraham and Sarah's child Yitzchak ultimately gets, almost slaughtered on the altar, and this child dies and sort of is brought back. There's a really interesting tradition, I started saying this, that sees the Akedah story as if it happened, right? And we actually say it in our davening, right? There are times on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur where we make allusion to the ashes of the sacrifice of Isaac on the altar, right? Right? And there are times where we say it. I think there are probably 5 or 6 times in source sheets where I've shown different places where we do that, but we refer to it in different piyutim, liturgical poems often. There's this whole idea that really got that Isaac is killed and then he was revived, right? And this is the foundation of Tchiyat HaMesim, one of the 13 cardinal principle of faith that God can revive the dead, right? Which is parenthetically also reinforced in our story. So that might be another comparison between those. And definitely it's a question of like a chicken and which caused what. Is it that this Haftarah is chosen to highlight the rabbinic tradition that Yitzchak was really killed and brought back to life, just like this child? Or was this Haftarah chosen by the same rabbis who believed in the rabbinic tradition, or I don't think it's about the facts, but what this means, and what this means on a spiritual and theological level, that Yitzchak was really killed. And this was just another way of hinting to that interpretation, right? Which way was it? I'm not sure, and I wouldn't know how to make the argument. But either way, right, this is Haftarah is chosen in tandem with that very popular idea in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Piyut, that at least maintains a notion that while Yitzchak survives, he's also killed at the same time. right? And he's revived. And so there's a Tchiyat HaMesim that happens here. So that's also an interesting comparison. I think the other fascinating comparison is, again, to the Jew in the pew who hasn't just had these 3 Haftarot of consolation, who there are no prophets to do miracles around them. And you look at Yitzchak, I mean, it's like the founding of the Jewish people, and we're about to, launch into Jewish history, and there are all these miracles that happen for them, that ultimately it's not, if the message of this Haftarah is that the intermediary of miracles is not prophets, but is God. And when the prophet takes on that too much, the prophet is at fault, and therefore that needs to be a corrective action, which is what happens at the end of our story. So then it leaves everyone reading that we don't need a prophet for miracles, that God calls the shots for miracles, and we can engage with God directly, right? Abraham and Sarah get the news via messengers, right? Lot is saved via a malach. Yitzchak is saved via a malach. Maybe you would read this parsha and you read these stories and think that there needs to be an intermediary to be able to redeem the people. And ultimately what this story leaves us thinking is, no, it's nice to have a prophet, but at the end of the day, it's Vayipalal al Hashem that ultimately saves the day. And that is just as true then as it was now, and it was in the story in the parsha. And perhaps that's also part of the theme of consolation that gets tied into our Haftarah, is this empower, if you read the story and you understand, and maybe that's why I would argue Ashkenazim go the full length, all 37 verses. We don't stop at the beginning, is because we want to capture this crescendo of praying to God, because ultimately that empowers our day-to-day action much stronger than, you went to the prophet and the prophet poured oil into your pots and saved you, and the prophet told Yitzchak that he would have a child, and the prophet saved Lot, and the prophet and the malach saved Yitzchak. It's a slightly different read. I haven't seen this anywhere. I sort of looked at all the traditional stomping grounds to see that, and I didn't see it. But for me, I find that very meaningful, right? That ultimately we're left with this message that it's up to God to perform miracles, and that we need to contact God for those miracles.
Rabbi, just
a
question about this transition that you referred to. Other than Eliyahu and Elisha, I don't sense that any of the prophets before them, not Shmuel, not Natan, or any of them, seem to be practicing overt miracles. It's like,
it seems like they're oracles. They're oracles of such.
Right.
Shaul, right, goes to seek out the prophet Shmuel to learn where his sheep are.
What? But that's still just conveying information that Hashem is providing.
That's a miracle. That's an individual miracle.
Right, but it's not. I mean, all of the prophets have some sort of, Ruach HaKodesh or some.
But it's not. And I say this with all the appropriate lahavdil and blasphemy. It's not a psyche where you go talk to a person and read my future, right? Yechezkel, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu never give the prophecy about an individual, right? You would never imagine them telling you where your lost keys are.
Right.
They're not a Find My iPhone app, right? But Shmuel seems to be that, right? Shmuel seems to play. There seems to be, we hear of these prophets. Elijah, meets someone who has sustained, the school, the University of Prophets. What are they doing? They're going around giving oracles to people, right? We don't have them recorded because they're not really necessary for history, but it seems like there are oracles that are going on that people get information from.
Right, but still, it's information as opposed to something changing natural
You're
law.
right. And I'll say that I think Elisha is the exaggerated example of that, which is why it's so important that he represents the change, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we, even from Shmuel to Yirmiyahu, this idea of in conveying individual information, right? God didn't wake up in the morning and decide that Shmuel needed to give, someone where their sheep were or where the next pot of gold was, right? But you could go to the prophet, you could pay the prophet something, and you could get that, right? There's no part in the story of Yirmiyahu, of Yechezkel, of these people that they're paid to give information that helps an individual. right? It's just not in their, it's not in their brand of prophecy. And they might not be those type of prophets, right? You have, it's interesting when we read the Nivot Hakashot, the consecration prophecies that open up these prophets, right? They keep saying, I'm not a Navi, I'm not a child of a Navi, right? They come to it in a different way. Elisha studied for years under Eliyahu. Gehazi studied for years under Elisha. Shmuel studied for years under Eli, right? There's a tradition and a legacy and a skill of being not just a prophet of God. Anyone can be a prophet of God, right? But being an oracle, being able to tap into that, beyond information that isn't just, if God wanted to give information to the people, anyone could do that, right? But to have that more oracle feature, that more magician, miracle worker, that seems to be a skill that needs to be honed. That was honed. We know of schools that people did that for, and that they would be able to bring water and they would be able to do this and be able to tell about the rains. That there seems to be some sort of, network that you could tap into. All right. Any other questions?
I have a question. I think for me, one of the things that was very interesting in this Haftarah was the contrast between the Shunamit and Sarah in the Parsha. She is a very, very modest woman, the Shunamit. And I always saw Sarah as being more outspoken. I mean, she doesn't say what she wants. They have to kind of figure it out. The Shunamit doesn't say what she wants. They have to kind of figure it out. And then towards the end, after her son has died, she says, all is well. I mean, to me, there's tremendous contrast there between her and Sarah.
Yeah. Also, even I'll add more, right? Abraham is given the prophecy, and what's the response, right? Sarah says she'll be, that Sarah is so old, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or Abraham thinks that, Sarah thinks that, whatever, but whatever it is, right? What does she say over here? That she gets the prophecy and her husband is so old.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Okay.
Again, it's just this interesting contrast.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, that is interesting.
But
it's so interesting as Sarah laughs. I mean, when she hears this, and I don't picture this Shunamit laughing.
Right. And actually, we see that there's a lot of, the emotion is more anxiety, right? She comes to the prophet and she says, she's her marala, her soul is embittered. Her soul is embittered. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Good.
All right. I can't hear you. Can someone talk?
Hello.
All right, good.
Hello.
my earbuds died, so.
Yeah, you were frozen, so we missed what you said.
I said, so at what point did you lose me?
I don't know. Why don't you say it again?
Right.
It was
so I was saying that she comes to the prophet. We're talking about what's her emotional state. Sarah laughs, right? What's her emotional state? So she comes to the prophet, and we say that it was marala. It was she was embittered. Her soul was embittered, right? And what did she say? Did I ask Me'et Adoni? Did I ask for a child? Did I ask for a child? No, I said, don't mislead me. Don't taunt me, right? That's her response. Her response is, is disbelief. And she goes on, and she, and you read, and this is where I was saying, and I saw Moshe Lichtenstein wrote about this a bit, about the interface with infertility. It's a really interesting read. And the prophet here also fails on that level, right? The prophet is not sensitive to her needs. You sure
that's right.
Better, this is like, if I were to name this Haftarah in 2021, mansplains, right? She says, I don't want anything because I know what you want more than you, right? And I'm going to give it to you, right? right? And clearly that's not good, right? And ultimately, it's not sustainable. And that actually hurts her more at the end. And there's an interesting pun here about, even in this language, right? What's the root of the word ask for, sha'al, right? Verse 28, right? It's a play on words. And so she says, didn't I tell you? Did I ask from you? Hashal ti, Ben, did I ask for a child? No. Hello, Amarti. What I did say is don't. And then we have a different root here, but it's the same. It's just missing the aleph, right? It's a different root. That means don't mislead me. Don't lead me astray. Don't mock me, right? So it's sort of a play on words here by using a similar shoresh. It's what I would say is probably like a literary flourish, a pun here, where she's saying, I didn't ask for this, and instead I told you don't do this, right? And don't mock me. And then she's left with that. And I think that's there's a certain missing component here of Elisha that he's not able to tap into what really needs to be happening. Right?
Yeah.
All right. Next week, we'll actually read some more of Malachim. We'll go all the way back to Kings. So all the way back to the beginning of it, excuse me. The first chapter, we're in Malachim Bet, the beginning of Malachim Bet here, chapter 4, which is that transition again, where we begin to see the prophets change. Next week in Chayesara, we'll read about the very beginning of Malachim, which begins with the death of David, right? You always think that Malachim should be that, but it's not that. So why don't we'll stop here, and we'll pick up next week.
Can I go back to Noach? Can I